did you say to me? Get off this plane now! You will not speak to me that way.
Imagine boarding a flight, settling into the seat you rightfully paid for, only to be told you don't belong there. Imagine staying calm, presenting your boarding pass again and again, and still being treated as if your presence was a mistake. Now, imagine the humiliation of a slap across your face, delivered not by a stranger in the crowd, but by the very crew sworn to ensure your safety. What would you do? Would you fight back in anger, or remain composed in the hope that dignity itself could become your shield? What if the passenger who endured that slap wasn't just any traveler, but the head of the Federal Aviation Authority, a woman whose voice carried the power to reshape an entire industry? This is not just a story about one flight. It is about injustice in the air, the courage of witnesses, the arrogance of power, and the legacy of a woman who refused to yield. By the time the wheels touched the ground, the world was already watching. Stay with us as we uncover the full story. And before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss stories that move hearts, challenge minds, and demand change. The boarding area at Dallas-Fort Worth hummed with the usual evening chaos. Families wrangled strollers. Business travelers checked their watches, and the loudspeaker cracked with the boarding calls that seemed to slice the air every 5 minutes. At Gate C-21, the crowd gathered for Skyward Air Flight 227 to Washington National. The plane, waiting at the jet bridge, was sleek, its silver body catching the last tint of orange light sliding down the terminal windows. Dr. Cassandra Wright stood near the priority boarding line, a calm figure in the sea of restless motion. She was not the tallest person in the room, nor the loudest. In fact, there was something about her quiet presence that made people either overlook her or feel vaguely unsettled. Cassandra had lived her whole life knowing that her stillness carried weight. At 53, her tightly coiled hair framed a face marked not by lines of fatigue, but by lines of determination. Tonight, her destination wasn't just another flight, it was another day returning to Washington, where tomorrow she was scheduled to present a major set of recommendations on passenger protections before a Senate committee. She had flown countless times before too many to count, yet every time she boarded, Cassandra carried an invisible armor. Flying while black, even with a first-class boarding pass, meant she had learned to anticipate the glances, the double checks, the subtle signals that her presence did not quite fit the image of who belonged in seat 2A. And still, she walked forward with the poise of someone who knew exactly who she was and exactly what she had earned. The gate agent scanned her ticket without a smile, eyes flicking briefly from Cassandra to the boarding pass, then back again, as if waiting for an error to appear. Cassandra held her breath a fraction longer than she wanted to. The familiar pause, the too long look, it was there again. Then the beep sounded. The green light flashed. The agent waved her through, perfunctory and flat. Cassandra exhaled and stepped onto the jet bridge. The hum of the air system grew louder as she approached the cabin. First class gleamed with its wide seats and crisp white headrest covers. Cassandra located 2A window side and slid her carry-on neatly into the overhead bin. She adjusted her blazer, sat down, and let her body settle into the leather cushion. For a brief moment, she closed her eyes, hearing the distant shuffle of other passengers filing in behind her. But the moment of peace didn't last. A sharp, cheerful voice rang out, one of those tones reserved for select customers. "Good evening. Welcome aboard the young blonde flight attendant. Badge reading Madison Cole," smiled brightly at a white man stepping into 2B. Madison leaned slightly toward him, offering help with his bag. When Cassandra had walked past earlier, Madison had barely lifted her eyes from her tablet. Cassandra noticed, but she said nothing. She had trained herself to pick her battles. Sometimes silence was not surrender. Sometimes silence was a strategy. She sat upright, fingers resting lightly on the armrest, as the cabin filled. A few minutes later, an older woman with a neat pearl necklace approached. She glanced at Cassandra, then at the seat number above. "Excuse me, are you sure this is 2A?" Her voice wasn't hostile, just clipped with the tone of someone used to being right. Cassandra smiled politely. "Yes, 2A is on my boarding pass." She slid the pass out briefly, showing the print. The woman's mouth tightened, and she nodded curtly before moving on. It wasn't unusual. Cassandra had been asked to prove her seat countless times, even when no one else was questioned. Madison returned, stopping near Cassandra's row. "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass again?" The words were sweet, but the implications stung. No one else had been asked twice. Cassandra handed it over, calm, her pulse steady. Madison studied it, then forced a smile. "All set. Thank you." She walked away quickly, as if embarrassed by her own suspicion. Cassandra leaned back, eyes fixed on the aisle. In her chest, the old familiar tension coiled an inner debate she knew too well. Should she let it slide again, chalk it up to routine, or should she press back, remind them that she deserved to be here as much as anyone? Her career, her decades of service, her authority in the aviation world, they never seemed to board with her. Only the color of her skin boarded first, visible to everyone, undeniable. She glanced out the window. The last glow of dusk painted the runway in amber streaks. She remembered her father, who had driven buses in Birmingham decades ago, telling her, "Baby girl, dignity isn't what they give you. It's what you don't let them take." Those words were a compass she still carried. Passengers continued filling the cabin. A tall brunette with designer luggage. Susan Whitmore hovered in the aisle near Cassandra's row. She glanced at her phone, then at Cassandra's seat. Cassandra could already sense something was about to unravel. Susan's expression wasn't uncertain, it was entitled, as though the seat under Cassandra was hers by default. Madison reappeared, chatting with Susan warmly, like greeting an old friend. Cassandra caught fragments. "Yes, right here in the front. Comfortable for you." Cassandra's eyes narrowed, her grip on the armrest tightened. The battle she had postponed was coming to her uninvited. Her mind flickered with questions. Do I speak now? Do I let them show their hand? Do I stand alone, or wait for others to see? The cabin around her bustled with ordinary life children whining. Overhead, bins slamming, boarding announcements echoing, but inside Cassandra's head, a storm brewed quietly. She straightened her back, smoothed her blazer, and prepared. Because she knew whether tonight or tomorrow, whether on this flight or at that Senate hearing, the fight for dignity was always boarding with her. The boarding door had barely closed when the tension began to crystallize. Cassandra adjusted her seatbelt loosely, allowing herself the small relief of knowing she was settled in 2A. She had carried herself onto countless flights with the armor of patience, but something in the air tonight felt different. Perhaps it was Madison's sidelong glances. Perhaps it was Susan Whitmore's sharp perfume lingering too close. Or perhaps it was the unease in Cassandra's chest that told her she might need every ounce of resolve before the wheels ever left the ground. Susan stood in the aisle with her designer tote clutched in one hand, lips pressed into a thin line. Her eyes darted from Cassandra to Madison and back again, like a courtroom witness expecting confirmation. She tilted her chin, voice pitched with certainty. "I'm supposed to be here. This is my seat." Cassandra looked up, calm and measured. "This is seat 2A?" My boarding pass confirms it. She spoke evenly, her tone firm without rising. She reached into her purse, produced the boarding pass again, and laid it gently on the armrest. The paper was not just a document, it was her shield, her proof, the tangible record of her belonging. Susan barely glanced at it before waving dismissively. No. I specifically requested a window in the front. This must be a mistake. They don't usually get it wrong with my status. Her eyes flicked to Madison, as though the flight attendant would straighten out this minor inconvenience by removing the woman already sitting there. Madison leaned down, sympathy painted across her face but directed entirely at Susan. "I'll take care of this," she whispered. Then, straightening up, she addressed Cassandra. "Ma'am, would you mind stepping out into the aisle for a moment so we can sort this out? It'll just be easier if you let me check with the system." Cassandra didn't move. "My boarding pass is correct. I'm in my seat already." Her voice carried no anger, only a steady calm. The firmness of her words seemed to ripple in the air. Madison's smile wavered. "It's just that sometimes the system duplicates seats. We'll resolve it quickly." She gestured again, a subtle push cloaked in customer service sweetness. Susan remained hovering, watching with thinly veiled impatience, as though the outcome was already assured. Inside Cassandra's chest, the old familiar battle churned. Part of her wanted to comply, to avoid drawing attention, to sidestep the ugly confrontation she could feel tightening around her. But another part, deeper and older, bristled. Why was she being asked to move when she had done everything right? Why was the presumption of error always attached to her? She thought of the Senate hearing scheduled for tomorrow. She imagined walking into that chamber, weary and unsettled, carrying the fresh memory of once again being diminished. And she thought of her father's voice, steady in her memory. "Dignity isn't what they give you. It's what you don't let them take." Cassandra inhaled slowly, grounding herself in that truth. "I'll stay in my seat," she said. "If there's a system issue, you can check it without moving me." Susan let out an incredulous laugh. "Are you serious? This is ridiculous. I fly skyward all the time. They know me by name. There's no way I'm supposed to be stuck somewhere else while she takes my spot." Her tone dripped with entitlement, as if Cassandra's very presence was an affront to the natural order. The words sliced through the cabin, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. A man in 3C shifted uneasily, his eyes darting between the women. A young couple in 1D and 1E paused their conversation, leaning slightly back to catch what was happening. Whispers traveled down the aisle like a current. Madison glanced around nervously, aware of the eyes upon her. She lowered her voice but made sure Susan could hear. "Ma'am," she said again to Cassandra, "I need you to cooperate so we can keep boarding smooth. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The phrase landed heavy. Don't make this harder. Cassandra knew that tone. It was the tone of blame shifted to the person standing their ground, the tone of authority cloaked in civility but brimming with threat. She looked up, locking eyes with Madison. Her silence stretched long enough to feel uncomfortable. Then she spoke, every word precise. "I am cooperating. I am in my assigned seat. There is nothing harder about me staying here." Madison's jaw tightened. Susan's impatience turned into indignation. She dropped her bag with a dramatic sigh, turning to address the aisle. "Unbelievable. Can you believe this? I pay for first class and now I'm told I don't even get the seat I reserved because what? Because she refuses to move." The emphasis on she was unmistakable, loaded, acidic. Several passengers looked down, unwilling to meet Cassandra's gaze, but the tension in the air was undeniable. One older man cleared his throat, as if he might intervene, but then settled back, muttering something to his wife instead. It was easier to avoid than to confront. Cassandra's mind raced even as her body remained still. She could feel her heart rate elevate, a thrum beneath her ribcage. She pressed her palms lightly against her thighs under the blanket of her blazer, grounding herself, silently reciting a verse of scripture she often turned to when calm threatened to slip away. The words steadied her, softened the edges of her anger into steel resolve. At that moment, the lead purser, Evelyn Sharp, approached. She was older, her gray-streaked hair pulled into a tight bun and her uniform pressed with precision. Her presence carried authority. She had been flying for decades, and everyone knew she commanded the cabin. Evelyn's eyes scanned the scene quickly. Her lips pursed. She addressed Susan first. What seems to be the problem? Susan gestured dramatically at Cassandra. She's in my seat. 2A. I've already explained, but she won't move. Evelyn's gaze shifted to Cassandra, not with kindness, but with the clinical detachment of someone calculating disruption. May I see your boarding pass, please, for the third time? Cassandra produced it. Evelyn studied it, then looked back at Susan. It does appear she is assigned 2A. Her tone, however, lacked resolution. She hesitated, then turned back to Cassandra. Sometimes the system double books. Would you mind taking another seat just for boarding so we can sort this out? The repetition was like a hammer pounding on Cassandra's resolve. Again, the burden of moving was placed on her, never on the woman making the claim. Cassandra lifted her chin slightly, a subtle signal of her refusal to shrink. No, this is my seat. The record is clear. I will not move. The firmness in her tone carried through the cabin. A ripple passed among the passengers. Rosa Vega, a younger flight attendant lingering near the galley, caught the words and looked sharply at Evelyn. Her brow furrowed, but she said nothing, biting her lip. She would remember this moment. Susan crossed her arms, shaking her head with exaggerated disbelief. This is outrageous. I'll be filing a complaint. I expect better treatment than this. Her voice cracked with fury, but beneath it, there was fear that the entitlement she had always carried might not be enough this time. Madison bent closer to Evelyn, whispering something about calling security if necessary. Evelyn nodded slowly, eyes narrowing. Cassandra caught the exchange and felt her pulse rise again. Security. The word carried weight. She knew how quickly situations could escalate once that line was crossed. She had read too many reports, seen too many videos. A black passenger resisting the request to move often ended with humiliation, handcuffs, or worse, inside her, the debate surged. Comply and sacrifice dignity, resist and risk escalation. She imagined her mother's voice now, not her father's. Her mother had always counseled caution. Pick your battles, Cassie. Sometimes survival is victory. But Cassandra also felt the weight of tomorrow's testimony, the eyes of a nation waiting for leadership on airline accountability. How could she stand before them if she surrendered her place tonight? Her mind whirled, her hands trembling slightly, though her face remained composed. She was calm on the outside, but inside she was fighting every instinct to flee and every duty to stay. Her decision hung in the air like a suspended breath. And then, without warning, Susan shoved her bag into the overhead bin with a loud thud, turned sharply, and leaned halfway into Cassandra's space. "Get up," she hissed. "This is mine." The venom in her tone stripped away any pretense of civility. Several passengers gasped audibly. The crack of confrontation echoed in the cabin, and the fragile balance snapped. What happened next would shake the entire flight and ripple far beyond this aircraft. The cabin had gone quiet, the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful, but charged, heavy, and waiting to break. Cassandra remained seated, her boarding pass still visible on the armrest, as though it were a shield she refused to lower. Susan stood rigid in the aisle, her eyes flashing with indignation. Madison hovered close, hands clasped in forced patience, while Evelyn's posture hardened into something resolute, like a judge who had already chosen a verdict. "Dr. Wright," Evelyn said, though she had never been told Cassandra's name, only read it from the boarding pass a moment earlier. The tone made it sound like an inconvenience rather than a courtesy. "We need you to step out into the aisle so we can resolve this calmly. You're holding up departure." Cassandra didn't flinch. "I'm not holding up anything. I am sitting in the seat I purchased, and I have done nothing wrong. The boarding pass confirms it." Her voice was low but carried a few rows back. A man shifted uncomfortably. Someone whispered, "She's right, though." The words were almost swallowed by the hum of the air system, but Cassandra heard them. It gave her the smallest flicker of strength. Madison leaned in, her smile now thin and strained. "Ma'am, please, we're just trying to keep the peace. If you could cooperate, we can reseat you somewhere else. It won't be for long. Maybe a seat in the back until we figure it out." The suggestion struck Cassandra like a blow. The back, the way Madison said it, carried the weight of history, the unspoken division that stretched back generations. Cassandra's pulse quickened. She saw her father's face in her mind again, remembered the stories he had told about city buses in Birmingham, about being told where he could and could not sit. She had promised herself long ago that if she had the power to resist that old script, she would. And here it was, again, rewritten in a modern uniform but carrying the same core message: you don't belong here. She inhaled slowly, her lips parting as she spoke carefully. "No. I will not move to the back of the plane. This is my seat. I will remain here." Susan let out a sharp laugh. "Unbelievable." "Do you see what I mean?" she said to Evelyn and Madison, gesturing toward Cassandra as though she were the disruption incarnate. "This is exactly why people like her cause problems on flights. She just refuses to listen." The words "people like her" were louder than anything else Susan had said. They hung in the air, thick and unmistakable. A young couple in the row ahead exchanged a look, uncomfortable but silent. Rosa Vega, still standing in the galley, shifted her weight and crossed her arms, her jaw tightening. She knew the words were wrong, but speaking out now would be career suicide. Her silence gnawed at her. Evelyn sighed, the sound heavy with exasperation. "If you do not comply, we'll have no choice but to involve security. This is your last chance to cooperate." Cassandra felt her breath catch. The word security was not neutral. For black passengers, it was a threat that carried consequences far beyond inconvenience. She had seen the videos of passengers dragged down aisles, handcuffed on tarmacs, humiliated in front of strangers. She had studied those cases in her official role. Now she was facing the very machine she had pledged to hold accountable. Inside, her thoughts collided violently. She imagined the news story African-American woman removed from first class for refusing to move seats. She imagined the Senate committee seeing the footage, wondering if she had lost her composure, doubting her credibility. She imagined her staff watching, wondering why their leader, who preached dignity and justice, couldn't even protect herself. Her hands trembled slightly, but she pressed them flat against her thighs, anchoring herself. Her mother's voice whispered from memory, "Pick your battles, Cassie. Sometimes survival is victory." But her father's echoed louder. "Dignity isn't what they give you. It's what you don't let them take." She clenched her jaw, looked up at Evelyn, and said, "Call security if you must, but I will not give up my seat." The words sliced through the cabin. For a moment, no one moved. Madison blinked rapidly, then stepped back, as if the sheer steadiness of Cassandra's refusal unsettled her. Susan muttered something under her breath, shaking her head and pulling her tote tighter against her chest. Evelyn gave a short nod to Madison. Fine. Get security. Madison hurried toward the galley, pulling out her intercom to call the ground team. The low murmur of the announcement carried through the cabin, and a wave of unease spread among passengers. A man in 4A pulled out his phone discreetly, angling it toward the front. Another woman pressed her husband's arm, whispering, "This doesn't look right." Cassandra sat rigid, her body trembling but her face composed. Her mind raced through scenarios. What would security assume when they arrived? Would they listen? Would they believe the boarding pass or the words of their colleagues in uniform? She rehearsed her statement silently, framing it with precision. She was not just a passenger, she was the administrator of the Federal Aviation Authority. But if she revealed that now, it would sound like a threat, a weapon. And she wasn't ready to play that card. Not yet. Susan shifted her weight impatiently. I can't believe this. We're wasting time because she wants to make a scene. Honestly, it's embarrassing for everyone. She spoke loudly enough for nearby rows to hear, feeding off their silence. Some passengers frowned, but most stayed quiet, unwilling to step into the fray. Rosa swallowed hard. Her training manuals always emphasized neutrality, de-escalation, following chain of command. But everything in her gut told her this was wrong. She could see Cassandra's composure, could feel the injustice burning like a silent alarm. Still, her feet felt glued to the galley floor. She bit the inside of her cheek until it hurt, her conscience wrestling with her fear. Minutes stretched. The hum of the cabin air mixed with the rising tension, and when the first security officer appeared at the front, the atmosphere shifted again. Officer Mark Jennings stepped on board, tall and brisk, with the air of someone who already believed the report he had been given. His eyes swept the cabin, landing on Cassandra with suspicion. Madison hurried to him, whispering quickly in his ear, painting her version of the story. Cassandra braced herself. She had seen this script before. The presumption of guilt was almost always immediate, and she felt the weight of being the one who would have to prove her innocence. Again. Jennings straightened and approached her row. "Ma'am," he said, voice clipped, "I understand you've been asked to move and you're refusing to comply. Is that correct?" Cassandra looked up, unflinching. "I am sitting in the seat assigned to me. This is my boarding pass. I have not refused to comply with any lawful instruction. I have refused to give up a seat that belongs to me." Jennings' lips pressed into a thin line. He glanced at Susan, who stood nearby with arms crossed, and then at Evelyn, who nodded gravely as though confirming his suspicion. His eyes returned to Cassandra. "If you don't step out of the seat right now, we may have to remove you from this aircraft." Cassandra's chest rose and fell slowly. The threat was real now. She could feel the eyes of the cabin drilling into her, some sympathetic, others curious, some perhaps judgmental. Her inner storm raged. Was she willing to risk humiliation, arrest, even injury to make this stand? Was the principle worth it? Or was surrender the safer path, preserving herself for the larger battles she had to fight? Her throat tightened, but when she spoke, her voice was steady. "I am not leaving this seat. I am not moving to the back of the plane. You may check the system, check the boarding record, but I will not be displaced." Jennings frowned. He leaned back slightly, clearly preparing to call for backup. But before he could, another figure appeared at the cabin entrance. Officer Daniel Ruiz stepped aboard, his demeanor calmer, his eyes scanning the scene with more care. He approached Jennings, who gestured toward Cassandra impatiently. Ruiz's gaze settled on Cassandra's boarding pass resting on the armrest. His expression shifted ever so slightly. The cabin waited, breathless. The storm was not over. In fact, it was only gathering force. The cabin seemed to shrink as Officer Daniel Ruiz stepped closer, his eyes sweeping the scene with more measured intent than his colleague. The tension that had been simmering now pressed against the walls, vibrating in the recycled air. Cassandra sat still, her body taut but unyielding, her boarding pass displayed like an anchor against the swirl of accusations. Every breath she drew was deliberate, every movement calculated not to betray the storm inside. Ruiz crouched slightly to Cassandra's level. "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass?" His voice was quieter, calmer than Jennings. Cassandra handed it over without hesitation. He studied it, nodded, then glanced at the seat marker above, his brow furrowed. "It says 2A, he murmured, mostly to himself. Then he looked back at her. "You're in the correct seat." Jennings stiffened beside him. "Daniel, we don't need to overcomplicate this. She's disrupting the boarding process. The crew's authority is clear. If they want her reseated, she has to comply." Ruiz frowned. "She's not refusing safety instructions. She's occupying the seat assigned to her." His eyes flicked toward Evelyn, who stood with arms crossed like a sentinel. Why was she asked to move in the first place? Evelyn's lips pursed. "Because we have a passenger with status who requested that seat." "We're trying to resolve it without escalation," Susan interjected, her tone sharp. "I didn't just request it. It's my seat. I'm always in the front row. I don't understand why this is even being questioned." Ruiz held her gaze a beat longer than she expected, and for the first time, a hint of uncertainty flickered in Susan's eyes. But before he could press further, Jennings stepped forward, his posture looming. "We're wasting time." "Ma'am," he barked at Cassandra, "stand up right now." Cassandra inhaled slowly. She could feel her pulse in her temples. The urge to rise, to flee, to surrender clawed at her. But deeper still was the conviction that this moment mattered more than her comfort, more than her fear. She lifted her chin and said evenly, "No." The single word seemed to shatter the fragile balance. Jennings' jaw clenched. Susan's mouth dropped open. Evelyn shook her head in disapproval. Madison muttered something under her breath about passengers who don't know how to behave. The weight of the cabin's silence pressed harder. Then it happened. Madison, who had been standing just behind Susan, suddenly lunged forward, her hand slicing the air with a sharp crack. Her palm connected with Cassandra's cheek in a motion so quick that many passengers gasped before they could even process what they'd seen. The sound of the slap rang through the cabin, louder than the hum of engines, louder than the whispers, louder than anything. For a moment, the world froze. Cassandra's head snapped slightly to the side, her hair shifting from the force, but her body remained seated, rigid. Heat blossomed across her skin, the sting searing not just her flesh, but her spirit. Her hands gripped the armrests, anchoring her to the seat as though she might otherwise float away. Gasps broke the stillness. A woman 2 rows back clapped a hand over her mouth. The man in 4A muttered, "Oh my God," under his breath as he raised his phone higher, the recording now undeniable. The young couple in 1D and 1E stared wide-eyed, frozen between disbelief and horror. Even Rosa, hidden near the galley, stepped forward instinctively. Her lips parted as if she might intervene, but stopped herself, fear locking her in place. Cassandra didn't speak. She didn't rise. She sat perfectly still, the silence radiating from her like a shield, refusing to give Madison the satisfaction of a reaction. Her cheek burned, but her dignity burned brighter. Inside, her mind screamed with the weight of history of men and women who had been struck down, told to move, told to yield. She felt their presence like an invisible chorus urging her to hold steady, Madison's face twisted with something she hadn't expected shock. It was as though she herself couldn't believe what she had just done. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by defensiveness. She wouldn't listen. Madison blurted, her voice shrill. She was being aggressive. I was trying to protect the other passengers. The lie fell flat in the cabin, thick with witnesses. The sting of the slap was not only on Cassandra's skin, but on every eye that had seen it. Murmurs rose, louder this time. Someone shouted, "That's assault!" Another voice called, "You can't hit her." The tide of silence that had protected the crew was breaking. Susan shrank back slightly, her certainty faltering. Even she seemed rattled by the violence that had unfolded so abruptly. Evelyn stepped forward, trying to regain control. "Everyone calm down," she commanded, her voice taut. "We need order here." Ruiz's eyes flared with alarm. "Cole, step back!" He barked at Madison, his voice suddenly hard. "Now!" He turned to Cassandra, his tone softening. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Cassandra finally moved, slowly, deliberately. She lifted her gaze to meet Ruiz's, her cheek flushed red, her eyes glistening with restrained fury, but her voice, when it came, was steady. "I am all right, but you all saw what just happened." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The cabin was listening. The recording devices were rolling. Every passenger who had hesitated before now knew the truth of what they had witnessed. Jennings scowled. She provoked it, he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. He glanced around and saw too many phones raised, too many eyes watching with judgment. The narrative he might have relied on was slipping beyond reach. Rosa's conscience finally snapped the chain of fear. She stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. "I saw it. She didn't provoke anything. Madison hit her." Her words cracked the last barrier. Several passengers nodded, some speaking up in agreement. "I saw it too. She was just sitting there. You can't treat people like that." Madison's face paled. Evelyn's jaw tightened. Susan sank into her seat, her confidence eroding under the glare of so many witnesses. Jennings looked cornered, his authority unraveling in real time. Ruiz straightened, his voice resolute. "This changes everything. We're not removing this passenger. We're documenting this incident fully." He turned to Cassandra, offering her back the boarding pass she had never stopped owning. "You are in your rightful seat." Cassandra took it gently, her fingers brushing his hand for the briefest second, gratitude flickering in her eyes. But the sting on her cheek remained, a burning reminder of how quickly dignity could be assaulted, how fragile justice could feel. Inside, she wrestled with the weight of the moment. She could feel the urge to unleash her identity, to declare who she was and what power she held. But she held back, knowing timing was everything. For now, her strength was in composure, in letting the evidence, the witnesses, the recordings, the truth speak louder than any title she could wield. The cabin buzzed with low murmurs, passengers whispering to each other, some already typing furiously on their phones. The story had begun to escape the walls of the aircraft, carried through social media before the wheels even touched the runway. Cassandra sat back, her cheek throbbing, her heart still racing, but her posture unbroken. She had not moved. She had not yielded. And in refusing, she had ignited something larger than herself. The sting of Madison's hand still radiated across Cassandra's cheek, a warmth that was both physical and symbolic. The cabin vibrated with whispers, the air so heavy it seemed the aircraft itself leaned in to listen. Rosa's brave words, passengers' murmurs, and Ruiz's declaration had shifted the tide, but tension still hung thick, because authority inside the cabin was fractured, and the hierarchy was scrambling to regain control. Evelyn Sharp raised her voice above the noise, her tone clipped and commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, Please put away your phones. Filming crew members without consent is against policy." Her words carried a sharpness designed to intimidate, but they had the opposite effect. Several passengers raised their devices higher, defiantly recording. A ripple of defiance ran through the rows. Susan Whitmore shrank into her seat, suddenly desperate not to be captured on camera, while Madison rubbed her own palms nervously, as if trying to erase what had just happened. Jennings lingered close, still radiating hostility, though his eyes darted nervously at the cluster of glowing phone screens. Ruiz stood firm, hands at his belt, his expression one of restrained fury. Cassandra sat still, one hand resting on her lap, the other lightly grazing the edge of the armrest. The fire inside her was contained, but the tremor in her chest told her the moment to remain silent was quickly passing. She had endured the indignity. She had shown restraint. But now the situation demanded clarity, not just for herself, but for everyone watching. Her inner voice urged caution. If she revealed her position now, it would change everything. It would shift the balance of power in an instant, but it would also expose her, make her the story rather than the principal. Was she ready for that? Was she ready to have her name trending by midnight, dissected by strangers who would never know the truth of her daily battles? Her fingers brushed the smooth edge of her boarding pass. She pictured the Senate chamber waiting for her tomorrow. She saw the headlines if she remained silent: "Black passenger assaulted on flight." It would be compelling, but incomplete. Her voice carried more than her pain. It carried authority, responsibility, the power to demand systemic change. The time had come to let that truth breathe. She straightened in her seat, her presence expanding beyond the leather cushion, filling the space with quiet authority. Her voice, when it emerged, was low but deliberate. "Everyone here needs to understand something." The cabin hushed, the whispers stilled, every lens and every ear tuned to her. "I am not just a passenger. I am Dr. Cassandra Wright, Administrator of the Federal Aviation Authority." The words landed like a thunderclap. Silence followed, but it was a silence charged with disbelief and awe. Susan's mouth fell open. Madison blinked rapidly, her face blanching as though the blood had drained from it. Evelyn's composure faltered, her eyes darting to Jennings, then back to Cassandra, recalculating everything in an instant. Ruiz's lips parted, his brows rising as he processed the weight of what had just been revealed. Gasps rolled through the cabin. A young man in 3D whispered to his seatmate, "She's the FAA chief." Another voice hissed, "Oh my God." The reality spread like wildfire, faster than any announcement could contain. Phones captured the moment, cameras zoomed in, and the viral arc of the story accelerated before anyone could think of stopping it. Cassandra didn't flinch. She let the silence extend, allowed the magnitude to settle over the cabin. Then she continued, her tone even but edged with steel. "The very agency responsible for the safety and fairness of your flights is the agency I lead. And tonight, on this aircraft, I was assaulted and repeatedly told I did not belong in a seat I paid for. That is not just an insult to me. It is an insult to every passenger who has ever been told their dignity is negotiable." Her words carved through the air, undeniable and sharp. No one dared interrupt. Rosa's eyes widened, tears glistening at the corners, a mix of relief and vindication. She pressed a hand against her chest, finally exhaling as though her lungs had been clenched for minutes. Evelyn tried to recover, her voice faltering as she spoke. "Dr. Wright, we had no idea. If there's been any misunderstanding, please allow us to correct it." The sudden shift in tone from accusatory to deferential was jarring, transparent in its desperation. Passengers muttered, some rolling their eyes, others shaking their heads. The performance fooled no one. Cassandra turned her head slightly, her cheek still flushed, and looked directly at Evelyn. A misunderstanding does not strike a passenger across the face. A misunderstanding does not insist again and again that a woman with a boarding pass move to the back of the plane. This is not about misunderstanding. This is about culture. A culture that says some bodies belong here, and others do not. Her words sliced deeper than any slap could. Evelyn's face stiffened. Madison shrank back, her eyes glassy with panic. Susan clutched her tote, trying to make herself invisible, though the weight of her entitlement hung over her like a spotlight. Jennings cleared his throat, attempting to reclaim authority. "Dr. Wright, with respect, this is a flight crew matter." The chain of command, Ruiz cut him off sharply. The chain of command ends where criminal behavior begins. What I witnessed was assault. And if you're not prepared to document that, I will. His voice rang with conviction. And for the first time, Jennings looked small, his bluster cracking under the weight of another officer's resolve. Cassandra felt the cabin shift again, the tide fully turning. Passengers began speaking louder now, emboldened by her revelation. She's right. It's systemic. I saw the whole thing. She was calm the entire time. One man even raised his voice directly toward Evelyn. If this is how you treat the head of the FAA, imagine how you treat everyone else. The truth was out. The illusion of control shattered. Evelyn and Madison's authority dissolved into the thin, recycled air of the cabin. Rosa stepped forward, trembling but determined. "Dr. Wright," she said softly, her voice carrying nonetheless. "If you need my statement, you'll have it." Everything I saw. Her courage sparked murmurs of approval. Passengers nodded. Some even clapped quietly. Cassandra inclined her head, a gesture of respect that spoke louder than thanks. Inside, her mind whirled with the weight of what had just unfolded. She knew this moment would echo far beyond this flight. There would be cameras waiting at the gate. There would be calls from Washington before she even landed. There would be hearings, investigations, headlines that would test her resilience in ways she could hardly anticipate. But she also knew this. She had not surrendered her dignity. She had stood her ground. And now, the truth had a name, a face, a story that could not be ignored. She turned back to Ruiz. "I want an official report filed immediately, every witness statement collected, and I want assurance that this flight crew will not be permitted to bury this under procedure." Ruiz nodded firmly. "You have my word." Dr. Wright. The cabin remained abuzz. Passengers buzzing with energy, some still filming, others whispering furiously into their phones, likely telling friends and family what they had just witnessed. Cassandra sat back, the leather of her seat cool against her back, her body finally exhaling a fraction of the tension it had carried. She reached for the small water bottle tucked in the seat pocket, twisted the cap, and drank slowly, letting the cold liquid steady her. Her cheek still burned, but now the sting felt different. It was no longer the mark of humiliation. It was the mark of resistance, of a line drawn and held. She closed her eyes briefly, hearing again her father's words, her mother's counsel, the chorus of history that lived inside her. This fight was never just about one seat. It was about every seat, every aisle, every cabin where dignity had been questioned. The jet bridge door finally sealed, the crew's chatter subdued into anxious silence. The engines roared to life, a low growl reverberating through the fuselage. Cassandra placed her boarding pass back into her purse, her hand lingering for a moment on the smooth paper. Tomorrow, in Washington, she would stand before senators and speak about accountability. But tonight, on Flight 227, she had shown what accountability looked like in real time. The aircraft pushed back from the gate. The journey ahead would not be smooth, in the air or beyond. But Cassandra Wright was ready. The engine's hum grew louder as the aircraft taxied, but inside the cabin, the true noise was human. Passengers buzzed in low voices, processing what had just unfolded, replaying the image of a flight attendant's hand striking a passenger who had remained calm throughout. But now they weren't simply passengers, they were witnesses, and the realization hung heavy in the air. Cassandra sat still, posture upright, cheek flushed with the fading mark of Madison's hand. She had revealed her identity, and the announcement had rippled like a shockwave. Yet she knew authority alone could not carry the truth. It would take testimony, courage, and a chorus of voices louder than denial. The first to speak again was Rosa Vega. She had already declared what she saw, but now she stepped further, walking into the aisle, her voice quivering at first, but strengthening with each word. I want the record to be clear. Doctor. Wright never raised her voice, never refused anything except to give up the seat she was assigned. I watched Madison strike her. I am prepared to file that statement in writing. The hush that followed was pierced by quiet applause. A man in row 3 leaned forward, clapping softly. Then others joined in. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, a heartbeat of solidarity. Madison paled, shrinking toward the galley as if distance could erase the act everyone had seen. Evelyn's glare fixed on Rosa, but the younger attendant didn't retreat. Her conscience had finally won the battle against fear. A passenger across the aisle, a woman in her late 30s with a toddler asleep in her arms, raised her voice carefully. I saw it too. I was watching the whole time because it didn't sit right with me from the start. She was calm. She didn't provoke anything. She shifted her child gently, then added, If you need my name for the report, you'll have it. Jennings muttered something under his breath, but Ruiz gave him a look sharp enough to silence him. The fair-minded officer pulled out a notepad from his jacket. Unusual for a setting like this, but clearly instinctual. Please, he said, turning toward the woman, let's start with your name and seat number. The simple act of taking testimony shifted the energy again. What had been chaos was becoming order, but not the order Evelyn wanted. It wasn't order dictated by uniforms and authority. It was order shaped by truth. The man in 4A, who had been recording since the beginning, cleared his throat. I've got video, clear as day, shows everything. I'll send it to you directly. He tilted his phone toward Ruiz, the screen glowing with frozen frames of Madison's hand in motion. Ruiz nodded, scribbling quickly, his professionalism sharp, but his expression tinged with disbelief. Susan, still sitting in the aisle seat nearby, shifted uncomfortably. Her once bold demeanor had dissolved. She fidgeted with her designer tote, her eyes darting between Cassandra and the passengers now rallying to her. I didn't expect it to go this far, she muttered quietly, though the words slipped out loud enough for the nearby rows to hear. Some turned toward her, their faces lined with disdain. For the first time, Susan seemed to realize she was no longer the favored party. She was a participant in a spectacle that had exposed entitlement in its rawest form. Cassandra remained silent through much of it, allowing others to fill the air. She understood the power of restraint. Every word spoken by witnesses reinforced what she had already lived. She didn't need to command the narrative. The truth was speaking for itself, amplified by those who had the courage to step forward. One by one, more passengers lent their voices. A businessman in row 5 stood and declared, I saw the entire exchange. She showed her boarding pass multiple times. There was no reason to escalate. A college student near the back called forward. I recorded too. I'll send my video. Each statement built upon the last, layering testimony into something undeniable. Rosa clasped her hands in front of her, her knuckles pale, but her eyes shone with determination. She had risked her job, perhaps her career, but the weight lifting from her shoulders was palpable. For the first time since training, she felt she had lived the true purpose of her role to protect passengers, not to protect power. Evelyn's control slipped further with every passing minute. She tried to reassert authority, speaking sternly, "This matter will be handled internally. Passengers should not interfere with crew operations." But the words rang hollow. A voice from the back called out, "You lost the right to handle it internally the second your crew laid hands on a passenger." The cabin murmured in agreement. Evelyn's authority, once absolute, had evaporated in the light of collective witness. Jennings shifted uncomfortably, caught between loyalty to the crew and the undeniable tide of evidence. His face reddened as he realized his earlier threats could now be construed as complicity. Ruiz, by contrast, stood straighter, his pen moving swiftly as he collected statements. He had aligned himself with truth, and passengers responded to him with trust. Cassandra's thoughts whirled beneath her calm exterior. She recognized the importance of this moment, not just for her, but for the system she represented. She knew videos would flood social media before the plane even reached cruising altitude. She knew the headlines were already writing themselves. But she also knew this no matter how powerful the cameras. The truth gained its real strength from people who dared to speak. Witnesses turned isolated indignity into collective reckoning. Her cheek throbbed, but the fire inside her steadied. She looked around the cabin, meeting eyes with those who had spoken, offering small nods of acknowledgement. These strangers, in lending their voices, had transformed the moment from humiliation to testimony. It would not be her story alone. It would be theirs, too. The plane lifted from the runway, engines roaring as the city lights fell away below. But inside, the spotlight remained fixed on row 2. Passengers leaned against headrests, whispering to each other, replaying what they had seen. Madison hid in the galley, tears streaking her face as she whispered frantic explanations to Evelyn, who shushed her sharply. Susan sat rigid, her tote clutched like a shield, avoiding every camera lens pointed her way. Ruiz continued collecting names, his pen scratching steadily. Rosa hovered nearby, ready to corroborate every word. Cassandra sat with eyes closed for a brief moment, inhaling deeply. She pictured the chambers of Washington, the senators waiting, the cameras flashing. She realized she wouldn't need to craft her testimony tomorrow. Tonight had written it for her. When she opened her eyes again, a sense of gravity anchored her. The slap had been the spark, but the chorus of witnesses was the fire, and this fire would not be extinguished. The aircraft had leveled off into cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign glowing faintly overhead. Normally, this was the moment when passengers settled into movies, drinks, or quiet conversations. But on Flight 227, normalcy had evaporated the moment Madison's hand struck Cassandra right. Now, the hum of the engines was drowned out by the buzz of a dozen phone screens glowing across the cabin. Passengers who had hesitated earlier now typed furiously. Some whispered into headsets, narrating the events to friends and family on the ground. Others were uploading videos, their thumbnails showing Cassandra calm in her seat, the red imprint of a slap still fresh across her cheek, Madison's hand frozen mid-motion. The uploads spread like sparks, and with each passing minute, the digital fire leapt from one platform to another. Cassandra sat still, hands folded on her lap, watching the glow of screens like distant stars. She knew what was happening. The story was already escaping the cabin, carried to millions before the plane would even touch down. She thought of the Senate chamber tomorrow, of cameras that would not only be waiting for her testimony, but now waiting for her personal story. The thought tightened her chest, yet she breathed steadily. This was no longer about choice. The storm had arrived, and she was at its center. Susan fidgeted beside the aisle, her confidence unraveling with every notification sound she heard around her. She pulled her sweater tighter, whispering under her breath. The entitlement that had fueled her demand for the seat was gone, replaced by dread. She knew her face was in those videos too, leaning into Cassandra's space, claiming what was not hers. She imagined the flood of commentary that would come her name, her firm, her reputation shredded before sunrise. Madison hid in the galley, her voice breaking as she whispered into the interphone. "They're recording everything. They're going to ruin me." Evelyn hushed her sharply, but even the lead purser's authority sounded brittle now. "Compose yourself," Evelyn hissed. "We'll deal with this when we land." Yet her own eyes betrayed fear. She had survived countless flights, countless conflicts, but she knew this one had already slipped beyond her control. Officer Ruiz moved calmly down the aisle, asking for names, taking notes, collecting videos directly from passengers. His presence steadied the cabin. When he stopped at Cassandra's row, he spoke low enough for her to hear, but with the gravity of an oath. "Dr. Wright, these passengers are with you. The record is clear. You have more allies here than adversaries." Cassandra met his eyes, gratitude flickering, but also a weight. Allies on a plane were one thing. Allies in the halls of power were another. Yet she understood that change began exactly this way, with ordinary people refusing to stay silent. Across the cabin, a college student in row 6 tapped furiously on his laptop, tethered to the plane's Wi-Fi. "It's trending," he whispered to his seatmate, eyes wide with disbelief. Hashtag Skyward Slap is already climbing. His friend craned to look. "It's viral. Thousands of shares already." The news spread through whispers like wildfire. Cassandra heard fragments carried on the air. Viral, trending, millions. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the reality settle. She had built her life on control, on composure, on measured leadership. Now she was becoming a symbol not because of her speeches or her policy work, but because of the sting of someone else's hand. The irony cut deep, yet she knew symbols carried weight, no matter how they were born. Susan's phone vibrated. She glanced down, her screen lighting up with messages. A friend's text read, "You're all over Twitter." What happened? Her blood drained. She shoved the phone into her bag as though hiding it could erase the truth. Passengers leaned into conversations. Some debated quietly. Others were openly outraged. A woman in row 2B turned toward Cassandra. "Dr. Wright, I want you to know you weren't alone in this. We all saw what happened. We'll speak if anyone asks." Cassandra nodded slightly, her throat tightening with emotion she refused to show. Jennings stood stiffly near the cockpit door, arms crossed, watching the cabin like a man losing his grip. He muttered under his breath to Evelyn, "We should shut this Wi-Fi off. Stop the spread before it gets worse." Evelyn gave him a sharp look. "It's already out. Cutting Wi-Fi now will only look like we're hiding something." For once, Evelyn's pragmatism aligned with truth. She understood the damage was irreversible. Rosa walked down the aisle quietly, pausing near Cassandra. She bent slightly, her voice soft but resolute. "I'll testify when we land. They won't silence me this time." Cassandra met her gaze, seeing the courage blooming in the young woman's eyes. Rosa's lips trembled, but her spine was straight. Cassandra wanted to reach out, to reassure her, but instead she offered a single nod, the kind of nod that carried the weight of solidarity. The cabin lights dimmed as the crew attempted to simulate calm, but the buzz didn't fade. Screens glowed brighter, passengers' whispers louder, and in that twilight atmosphere, the truth carried more power than any scripted announcement. Cassandra leaned her head back against the seat, eyes fixed on the overhead panel. Her thoughts spiraled inward. She remembered years of hearings where data and reports were debated endlessly, where policy felt like an abstract exercise. Tonight was not abstract. Tonight, her own skin bore the evidence of systemic rot. She wrestled with the irony. Had she not been who she was, would this cabin have rallied, or would she have been dragged off, humiliated in silence? The thought twisted in her chest. She was determined that tomorrow's testimony would no longer be theoretical. It would be living proof. She whispered to herself, so low no one else could hear. Dignity isn't granted. It's defended. The words steadied her pulse. In the back, a teenager refreshed his feet again and gasped, "It's on CNN already." They picked it up. Heads turned, passengers murmuring louder. Cassandra felt the shift ripple again. The storm was no longer midair, it was nationwide. Susan buried her face in her hands. Madison wept quietly in the galley. Evelyn's jaw was tight as stone. Jennings cursed under his breath. Ruiz kept writing, calm amidst the storm. Rosa stood taller than she ever had before. And Cassandra sat in silence, her strength no longer just her own, but multiplied by the voices, cameras, and courage surrounding her. The world was watching now. The descent announcement crackled over the intercom, but no one on Flight 227 seemed to hear it. The cabin was still buzzing with tension, whispers, and the glow of screens. Cassandra sat motionless, eyes steady, while inside her chest her heart thudded with the weight of what awaited her on the ground. She knew the storm had already escaped this aircraft. By the time the wheels touched the runway, the world would be waiting. Madison stayed hidden in the galley, her sobs now muted to shallow breaths, her career unraveling before her eyes. Evelyn paced like a general whose troops had deserted her. She kept her voice low when she addressed the crew, but passengers close enough could hear. "Do not speak to the media. Do not make statements. Everything goes through the company." Her words, meant to steady, only betrayed desperation. Ruiz moved steadily down the aisle once more, checking names, reminding passengers to keep their videos safe for official use. His calm demeanor was the one thing preventing the cabin from tipping into chaos. Jennings, on the other hand, stood rigid near the cockpit door, his posture defensive, his eyes cold, as if hoping to reclaim authority that had long since dissolved. Cassandra stared out the window at the sprawl of lights below, the city drawing closer. She tried to collect her thoughts, rehearsing silently what she might say when reporters inevitably pressed microphones into her face. She felt her mother's caution echoing in her ear, her father's fire in her chest, and her own voice searching for balance between dignity and outrage. The wheels struck the runway with a jolt, the reverse thrusters roaring as the plane decelerated. The landing was smooth enough, but the tension in the cabin did not ease. In fact, it thickened. Passengers sat upright, phones in hand, waiting to capture whatever unfolded next. Cassandra's stomach tightened, but her expression remained serene. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Evelyn's voice broke through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you remain seated until the aircraft has come to a complete stop. Please remember it is against policy to record crew operations." Her voice quivered on the last words. The warning sounded hollow. Nearly every passenger ignored it, their devices still raised. The jet bridge connected with a hollow thud. The door opened. What greeted them was not the usual quiet of an airport gate, but a wall of flashing cameras, voices calling, security officers waiting with clipboards and radios. The story had not waited for them to arrive. It had grown larger than the plane itself. Reporters pressed forward against the gate barrier, microphones raised. "Is it true the FAA administrator was assaulted on this flight, Doctor?" "Right. Can you confirm what happened?" The questions tumbled over each other in a storm of voices. Cassandra rose slowly, her presence commanding without effort. She adjusted her blazer, smoothed her hair, and clutched her purse tightly. The red imprint on her cheek was still faintly visible, a silent testimony of what had unfolded. She turned to Rosa, who stood nearby, trembling but resolute. "Stay close," Cassandra murmured softly. Rosa nodded. Security officers entered the cabin not to drag Cassandra away, but to escort her out. Ruiz took the lead, gesturing politely but firmly for space. "Clear a path, please." His authority carried weight, and passengers complied, leaning back but still filming every step. Madison did not move from the galley. Evelyn stood frozen at the front, watching as Cassandra passed, her face locked in a mask of professional detachment that fooled no one. Jennings avoided Cassandra's gaze, his jaw clenched as though swallowing the bitter taste of defeat. When Cassandra stepped into the jet bridge, the flash of cameras nearly blinded her. Reporters shouted louder now, their voices echoing. She lifted a hand slightly, signaling for quiet, and the surprising calm that followed proved her presence had already grown larger than the noise. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying clearly. "Tonight, on this flight, I experienced what too many passengers have endured in silence. I was struck across the face after refusing to give up a seat I purchased. I was told I did not belong where I rightfully sat. And yet, thanks to the courage of witnesses who refused to stay silent, the truth cannot be hidden." Gasps rippled through the gathered crowd. Cameras captured every word, lenses zooming on her calm expression, the red mark on her cheek, the poise in her voice. "This is not only about me," Cassandra continued. "It is about every traveler who has been made to feel lesser, every voice dismissed, every dignity denied. What happened here tonight will not be buried in reports or silenced by procedure. It will be investigated, and it will be answered." Applause broke out from passengers who had followed her into the jet bridge. The sound was raw, unfiltered, a declaration that they had witnessed the truth and would carry it forward. Cassandra inclined her head slightly, acknowledging their support, but inside her chest a storm still raged. A reporter shouted from the crowd, "Doctor, Wright, will you press charges?" Cassandra paused, her lips parting slightly. Then she said, "What I will press is accountability, not only for individuals, but for the systems that enable such behavior. Justice is not vengeance. Justice is change." The quote would run in headlines within the hour. It would be repeated on every network, analyzed, praised, debated. Cassandra's words had shifted the story from scandal to movement. Behind her, Rosa stood tall, her eyes glistening with tears, knowing she too would soon be called to speak. Susan slipped out quietly, head bowed, shielded by her tote bag, but unable to escape the judgment of cameras that caught her every movement. Madison was escorted off separately, her shoulders slumped, her career collapsing with each flash of light. Evelyn walked stiffly, muttering about procedure, though no one was listening anymore. Outside the gate, more cameras waited. Cassandra walked forward, her stride steady, her presence commanding. She knew tonight was only the beginning. Tomorrow would bring hearings, investigations, and the machinery of accountability grinding into motion. But tonight she had carried herself with dignity through humiliation, and that dignity had become contagious. Passengers streamed out behind her, some still recording, others speaking to reporters, their voices weaving together into a chorus of truth. The storm that had begun with a single slap was now a hurricane, sweeping through the media, the public, and soon the halls of power. And in the center of it all was Cassandra Wright, walking with calm defiance, carrying not just her own story, but the story of countless others who had been told to move, to yield, to disappear. She was not disappearing. She was stepping into the light, The storm did not wait for morning. By the time Cassandra was escorted into a quiet lounge at Washington National Airport, the videos from Flight 227 had already spread across every major network and platform. Headlines blared, FAA administrator slapped on flight, #Skyward Slap trended across continents. The slap was replayed again and again on television screens mounted in the airport, passengers stopping mid-stride to gasp or shake their heads. Cassandra's name, her face, her composure in the chaos, all of it had become a national flashpoint before she could even change clothes. She sat in a quiet corner, her phone buzzing relentlessly with calls and messages from senators, aides, and journalists. She silenced it, taking a long sip of water, trying to steady the firestorm within her. The sting on her cheek had faded to a dull ache, but the emotional weight was only beginning to crest. She knew the airline would not stay silent. They would be scrambling, their boardrooms ablaze, searching for a way to contain the damage. In a glass tower downtown, Skyward Air's executives were doing exactly that. CEO Richard Keene paced the conference room, his tie loosened, his face flushed. Around him sat his closest advisors, legal counsel, communications directors, and operations chiefs. The atmosphere was grim. On the large screen at the end of the table, the viral video played in an endless loop. Madison's hand striking Cassandra, the gasp of the passengers, the unmistakable truth. Keene slammed a fist onto the table. We cannot let this destroy us. We're the largest carrier in the country. One incident cannot define us. His words rang hollow even to himself. The image on the screen defined everything. The communications director, a woman with tired eyes, leaned forward. We need a statement. Tonight. Something that acknowledges the incident but frames it as isolated. We emphasize our commitment to safety and fairness. We do not admit systemic failure. The legal counsel interjected, careful. Any admission could increase liability. Already we're looking at civil exposure, maybe criminal if the FAA pushes hard. If we acknowledge fault, we're opening ourselves to damages in the hundreds of millions. Keene shook his head, his jaw tight. What about Dr. Right. We didn't know it was her. Had we known, none of this would have happened. The room went silent. They all understood the implication. The issue was not that she had been mistreated, but that she had been someone too powerful to mistreat. It was the very logic that had led to the slap in the first place, the assumption that dignity depended on who you were. The communications director spoke carefully. We can try to paint this as a misunderstanding. Say tensions were high, that procedures were misapplied. We emphasize that the matter is under investigation. The operations chief added, we suspend Madison immediately. Maybe Evelyn too. Sacrifice a few careers to protect the brand. Keene considered it, his eyes flicking to the looping video. The image was unforgiving. Draft a statement, he said finally. Release it before midnight. Back in the lounge, Cassandra watched as her aide forwarded her the company's press release. She read the words slowly, each sentence calculated and hollow. Skyward Air regrets an incident on Flight 227. We are reviewing internal procedures. We remain committed to the highest standards of customer care. The actions of a few do not represent our values. Cassandra felt her jaw tighten. There it was, the cover-up forming in real time. No acknowledgement of her name, no acknowledgement of the slap, no acknowledgement of systemic bias, just a vague apology to customers as though the sting on her cheek had been a minor inconvenience. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Senator Howard Brooks, chair of the committee she was scheduled to address tomorrow. She answered, her voice calm despite the storm. Dr. Right, Brooks said, his voice steady. I've seen the footage. The country has seen it. Tomorrow's hearing just changed. It's no longer theoretical. It's personal. "Are you ready for this?" Cassandra closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them, her voice clear. "Senator, I have been ready my entire life. What happened tonight is not about me. It is about everyone who has been told to move, to yield, to accept indignity. Tomorrow, I will not just testify, I will demand change." Brooks was quiet for a beat, then said, "Good, because the world will be watching." Across town, Skyward Air's executives polished their statement, rehearsing talking points, bracing for damage control interviews. Keene rehearsed phrases in the mirror isolated incident, deeply regrettable, our values. He believed that, with the right spin, with enough corporate polish, they could weather the storm. But outside the glass walls of their tower, the public mood was shifting. On social media, passengers' testimonies poured out. Clips of Rosa's trembling voice declaring Madison had struck Cassandra went viral. The businessman in row 5 gave a live interview to a local news station before even leaving the airport. "I saw everything," he said. "She was calm, composed. They went after her because of who she was, not what she did, and when they realized who she really was, they changed their tune. That tells you everything." By midnight, petitions were circulating calling for Madison's firing, Evelyn's resignation, Jennings's suspension, and Skyward Air's leadership to testify before Congress. The airline's statement, meant to calm, was instead mocked. Commentators called it empty, evasive, tone-deaf. The cover-up attempt was failing before it began. Cassandra lay in her hotel room hours later, the city lights flickering beyond the window. Her cheek no longer throbbed, but the memory did. She replayed the moment over and over, the sound of the slap echoing in her ears, the silence of passengers before they found their courage, the chorus of voices that followed. She thought of Rosa, of Ruiz, of strangers who had chosen truth over silence. She knew they were risking much, and she would not let their courage be wasted. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from a trusted aide, Keene, is calling around to senators. He's trying to frame it as isolated. He's offering private briefings. Cassandra exhaled slowly. The cover-up was real, but so was the evidence. Tomorrow, the stage would shift to Washington, and the airline's power would collide with her own authority. The fight would not be easy. They would try to smear, to minimize, to silence. But the truth was louder now than it had ever been. She closed her eyes and whispered again the words she had carried with her through every battle. Dignity isn't granted, it's defended. And tomorrow, she would defend it not just for herself, but for millions. The marble halls of Capitol Hill gleamed under bright lights as the country waited for answers. Reporters crowded outside the Senate chamber, their microphones raised like weapons, the hum of live broadcasts spilling into the corridors. Overnight, Flight 227 had transformed from an airline dispute into a national reckoning. Now, the players who had been trapped in that aircraft would face the nation. Inside the chamber, senators settled into their seats, staffers shuffled papers, and cameras buzzed softly as they adjusted lenses. The air was thick with anticipation. At the center of it all sat Dr. Cassandra Wright, her posture straight, her expression composed but firm. She wore a navy suit that carried the weight of her office, and the faint trace of the slap on her cheek was still visible under careful makeup. She had chosen not to cover it entirely. She wanted the country to see. To her left sat Senator Howard Brooks, chair of the committee, his face stern as he tapped his gavel. Across from her, flanked by attorneys, was Richard Keene, CEO of Skyward Air. He looked polished in his charcoal suit, but his eyes betrayed exhaustion. He had spent the night rehearsing lines of contrition, but no rehearsal could mask the fear of a man about to be cross-examined on live television. Brooks spoke first, his voice steady but edged with steel. This hearing was scheduled long before the incident on Flight 227. We intended to discuss accountability and equity in air travel. But the events of last night have made the issue painfully clear. We are not here to debate theory. We are here to confront reality. He gestured toward Cassandra. Dr. Wright, thank you for being here under difficult circumstances. Please describe, in your own words, what occurred. The chamber hushed. Cassandra leaned forward slightly, her hands folded on the table, her voice even and deliberate. Senators, what happened last night was not a misunderstanding. I was seated in 2A, the seat I purchased. A white passenger claimed the seat as hers. The crew, without verifying records, repeatedly insisted I move. When I refused, as was my right, I was threatened with removal. Then, in front of dozens of witnesses, I was struck across the face by a flight attendant. Gasps and murmurs spread through the chamber, even among those who had already seen the footage. The gravity of Cassandra's voice made the video real in a new way. She continued, her gaze unwavering. I was calm. I was composed. I was not disruptive. Yet I was treated as though my presence in first class was a mistake to be corrected. Only when I revealed my identity as administrator of the Federal Aviation Authority did the tone change. That alone should tell you everything. Her words landed with the weight of truth, sharpened by dignity. Brooks nodded gravely. Thank you, Dr. Wright. He turned to Keene. Mr. Keene, your company issued a statement last night calling this an isolated incident. Do you stand by that characterization? Keene cleared his throat, his voice carefully modulated. Senator, first let me express my deepest regret to Dr. Wright and to every passenger on Flight 227. What happened was unacceptable. It does not reflect the values of Skyward Air. We have already suspended the individuals involved and launched an internal investigation. Brooks leaned forward. So you stand by the claim that this is isolated? Keene hesitated, his eyes flicking to his attorney. We believe the actions taken by a few employees do not represent systemic issues within our airline. A ripple of disapproval moved through the chamber. Cassandra's lips tightened, but she did not interrupt. Instead, Brooks turned back to her. Dr. Wright, do you believe what you experienced was isolated? She shook her head slowly. No. Senator, what I experienced was part of a pattern. I have reviewed hundreds of complaints from passengers describing treatment strikingly similar to mine passengers asked to move seats without cause. Passengers targeted because of the color of their skin or the sound of their accent. Last night's incident was not an anomaly. It was exposure. Her words struck like a hammer. Cameras zoomed in on Keene's face, capturing the tightening of his jaw, the way he shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Senator Maria Sanchez leaned forward next. Dr. Wright, can you confirm that passengers on Flight 227 provided testimony and video evidence supporting your account? Yes, Cassandra said firmly. Multiple passengers stepped forward. Their statements align with the videos already released publicly. These are not just my words. They are the words of a community that refused to stay silent. Senator Thomas Green turned his gaze to Keene. Mr. Keene, did your airline attempt to discourage passengers from recording or releasing video of the incident? Keene fumbled. We ask passengers not to film crew for privacy and safety reasons. That is standard policy across the industry. Green pressed. But in this case, those recordings are the only reason we are having this conversation. Without them, your statement would have painted Dr. Wright as a disruptive passenger. Isn't that correct? Keene shifted, sweat beating at his temple. Senator, I cannot speculate. You don't have to. Green cut in sharply. The public saw the truth, and that truth contradicts your narrative. The chamber buzzed with murmurs, journalists scribbling furiously. Cassandra sat still, her silence more powerful than any rebuttal. She understood that Keene was unraveling on his own, tangled in the contradictions of a system built to protect itself. Then Rosa Vega was called to testify. She walked forward nervously, her hands trembling as she adjusted the microphone. She looked young against the weight of the chamber, but her voice carried when she spoke. I was in the galley that night. I saw everything. Dr. Wright was calm. She showed her boarding pass multiple times. Madison Cole struck her. There was no provocation. When she refused to move, she was treated as if she were the problem. I knew it was wrong, and I am here because silence would make me complicit. The words brought the chamber to life. Some senators nodded. Others looked visibly moved. Rosa's courage was palpable. Cassandra turned slightly toward her, giving her a small nod of gratitude. Keene's attorney whispered furiously in his ear, but the cameras had already captured the story that mattered: the contrast between Cassandra's dignity, Rosa's honesty, and Keene's evasions. Senator Brooks tapped the gavel again. What we have here is not just misconduct. It is evidence of systemic bias and a culture of denial. This committee will not accept corporate statements of regret without accountability. Mr. Keene, prepare to answer not just to us, but to the American people. The gavel struck once more. Reporters surged toward the exits, eager to beam the story to the world. Cassandra exhaled slowly, her hands unclasping under the table. She had endured humiliation, she had resisted silence, and now she had spoken her truth in the highest chamber of accountability. The fight was far from over, but the tide had turned. The morning after the Senate hearing, headlines dominated every front page, every broadcast, every trending feed. The slap on Flight 227 had become a symbol larger than itself. Cassandra Wright's words, "Justice is not vengeance. Justice is change," were repeated in editorials, carved into protest signs, echoed in news anchors' closing monologues. The story had broken past aviation into the fabric of the country. For Skyward Air, the fallout was immediate. Share prices dropped 12% by noon, a free fall that rattled investors. Advertisers quietly began withdrawing campaigns from in-flight magazines. The once proud airline found itself the target of boycotts, hashtags urging passengers to choose any other carrier. The company's polished statement calling the incident isolated was mocked relentlessly online. Inside the airline's headquarters, chaos reigned. Richard Keene called emergency board meetings, but the damage could not be contained by corporate spin. Senators demanded his resignation. Advocacy groups filed lawsuits. Civil rights attorneys assembled coalitions. The Department of Transportation opened a federal investigation, and whispers of criminal charges circulated. Cassandra watched from her office in Washington as the storm unfolded. She did not gloat. Her expression remained steady, her focus sharp. She knew victory was not humiliation for her adversaries. Victory was transformation. She had not endured the humiliation of that slap for headlines. She had endured it so the system might finally be forced to change. When she walked into her agency the morning after the hearing, staffers stood in the lobby, applauding softly as she entered. Some were teary-eyed. Cassandra raised a hand, signaling calm. "Thank you," she said simply. "But remember, this is not about me. It is about what comes next." What came next was swift and unprecedented. Skyward Air announced that Madison Cole had been terminated. Evelyn Sharp suspended pending investigation, and Officer Mark Jennings placed on leave. Rosa Vega was quietly reassigned, but quickly reached out by civil rights attorneys who praised her courage and promised her protection. Yet these individual measures were not enough. The pressure kept mounting. Within weeks, under relentless public scrutiny, Skyward Air announced the resignation of Richard Keene as CEO. The board appointed an interim leader and pledged sweeping reforms, mandatory anti-bias training for all employees, creation of an independent passenger rights oversight board, and a multi-million-dollar settlement fund for victims of discrimination. It was an attempt to salvage reputation, but the public demanded more. Congress seized the moment. A bipartisan group of senators introduced the Passenger Dignity Act, legislation requiring airlines to implement transparent procedures for seat disputes, mandating body cameras for flight attendants during boarding, and empowering the FAA to impose direct penalties for discriminatory treatment. Cassandra testified again, this time not as a victim, but as an architect of reform. Her words resonated. An airplane is not only a vessel of travel, it is a vessel of society. And society must not tolerate indignity at 30,000 feet any more than it does on the ground. The act passed the Senate with overwhelming support. For the first time in decades, passengers' rights were expanded in tangible ways. Airlines scrambled to comply, but the momentum was unstoppable. Other industries watched, learning that the public's patience for bias disguised as policy had expired. Meanwhile, the human stories from Flight 227 continued to ripple outward. Rosa Vega, once afraid of speaking, became a public advocate, invited to panels and conferences. She spoke honestly about the fear of losing her job, the guilt of her silence, and the moment she chose courage. She became a symbol for employees trapped between conscience and command. Officer Daniel Ruiz was commended publicly by the FAA for his integrity. He was promoted, his steady presence now cited as an example of what law enforcement in aviation should look like. Jennings, by contrast, resigned quietly, his reputation stained by his reflex to protect power rather than passengers. Susan Whitmore faced consequences far beyond the cabin. Her law firm placed her on indefinite leave after clients threatened to withdraw. She became a reluctant cautionary tale about entitlement and exposure in the digital age. Her name was now inseparable from the viral videos. Her reputation damaged in ways she had never imagined. And Madison Cole, once a rising young flight attendant, faded into the shadows of scandal. She gave one tearful interview months later, blaming stress and poor training, but the public had already judged her. Cassandra never mentioned her again. She knew focusing on individuals missed the larger point. Systems, not scapegoats, were the true battleground. Cassandra herself became something she had not sought, a national figure. Editorials praised her composure, activists hailed her as a champion, and ordinary travelers wrote letters describing their own humiliations in the skies. She read each one carefully, often late at night, reminding herself of the weight of the fight. She had become not just a regulator, but a voice, and she carried that responsibility with quiet determination. The reforms spread further than even Cassandra expected. Airlines adopted new technology to document interactions. Training programs shifted from box-checking exercises to immersive courses, and union contracts began including protections against discrimination. The slap that began as a single moment of violence had forced an entire industry to confront its failures. Months later, Cassandra returned to Dallas, the very airport where Flight 227 had departed. She stood in the terminal, watching travelers hurry to gates, roll suitcases across polished floors, hug loved ones goodbye. She thought of the night that had begun in this place, the humiliation she had endured, and the transformation that followed. The memory still stung, but now it was bound with something else, purpose. A reporter who recognized her approached cautiously. Microphone in hand. Dr. Wright. Do you ever regret revealing your identity that night? Cassandra smiled faintly. I regret that it was necessary, she said, but I do not regret defending my dignity, because dignity is not mine alone. It belongs to everyone who steps on a plane, everyone who takes a seat, everyone who deserves to be treated with respect. If my story reminded the world of that, then it was worth it. Her words would be quoted again, replayed, carved into the record of reform. But in that moment, she spoke not to the cameras, but to the memory of the passengers who had whispered courage into the cabin, who had raised their phones, who had refused to let the truth disappear. The fallout had been fierce, the reforms sweeping, but Cassandra knew the work was not finished. Bias was resilient, injustice resourceful, yet she also knew dignity could be just as resilient, justice just as resourceful, if people were willing to defend it. And she had made her choice long ago. 6 months had passed since Flight 227, yet the echoes of that night still reverberated through the nation. The reforms born from Cassandra Wright's testimony had already begun reshaping the skies. Airlines across the country rolled out new training programs, oversight boards, and technology designed to protect passengers' dignity. The Passenger Dignity Act had passed into law, carrying Cassandra's fingerprints on every line. Travelers spoke of the changes, some skeptical, others grateful, but all aware that something fundamental had shifted. For Cassandra, the months had been a blur of hearings, speeches, and meetings. She had been thrust into a role she never sought, elevated from a respected administrator into a symbol of resilience. Everywhere she went, strangers approached with quiet words of thanks. Some spoke of humiliations they had endured on planes, in offices, in classrooms. Others simply said, "You made me feel seen." Cassandra listened to each story, her heart heavy with their pain, but steady in her resolve. Yet when the noise of the day faded, when the cameras dimmed and the speeches ended, Cassandra often sat alone, grappling with the personal cost. She thought of the slap itself, the sting that had faded from her cheek, but not from her memory. She thought of the silence that followed, before the courage of witnesses broke it. And she thought of the long road ahead, knowing that laws could change quickly, but hearts changed slowly. On a crisp autumn evening, Cassandra boarded a flight once again. The symbolism was not lost on her. Cameras were not present this time. No reporters jostled for quotes. She was just another passenger walking down the jet bridge, ticket in hand. She felt eyes following her, some passengers recognizing her, others simply curious. She settled into her seat first class again, not because of vanity, but because she had earned it, and looked out the window at the fading light. A young woman seated beside her leaned slightly and whispered, "Are you Dr. Right?" Cassandra turned and nodded gently. The woman's eyes filled with emotion. "I watched your testimony. I've worked in aviation for years. I've seen things I didn't know how to speak up about. Because of you, I found my voice. I just wanted to say thank you." Cassandra smiled softly. "You don't owe me thanks. You owe yourself honesty. And you've already given that gift." The plane lifted into the sky, the city lights shrinking below. For a moment, Cassandra closed her eyes and allowed herself to breathe, to simply exist as a traveler rather than a symbol. Yet even in that quiet, she felt the weight of legacy pressing on her shoulders. Back on the ground, the ripples of Flight 227 continued to spread. Rosa Vega had become a sought-after speaker, telling her story at universities and industry conferences. She spoke not only of the slap, but of her own silence, and how she broke it. Her words carried power, inspiring others to confront fear and choose truth. Officer Daniel Ruiz had risen through the ranks, now tasked with leading a new division on passenger rights enforcement. His calm integrity had become the model for training across airports. Susan Whitmore remained largely out of public view, her once bright career dimmed. Yet in small circles she began volunteering, speaking to young professionals about entitlement and humility. Whether her change was redemption or survival, no one could fully know. But her silence was gone. She had been forced to confront herself in ways comfort never demanded. Madison Cole had disappeared almost entirely, retreating from the spotlight. Evelyn Sharp quietly resigned, her name remembered only in reports. Mark Jennings faded into obscurity. His authority shattered the moment passengers chose courage over fear. Cassandra knew their stories mattered too, not as villains in isolation, but as reminders of the system that had produced them. She refused to see them as mere caricatures of cruelty. They were flawed humans within a flawed structure. The real victory was not their downfall, but the system's reckoning. One evening, Cassandra stood at a podium at a national aviation conference. The hall was filled with executives, union leaders, advocates, and young trainees. She spoke plainly, her voice steady but charged with quiet conviction. We are gathered here not because of a slap, but because of what it revealed. Airplanes are microcosms of our society. The altitude does not lift us above our prejudices. What happened on Flight 227 is a reminder that dignity must be defended in every seat, on every flight, for every passenger. The reforms we have enacted are not the end. They are only the beginning. Change will not come from laws alone, but from the choices each of you make when you face a moment of truth. The hall rose in applause, the sound echoing like thunder. Cassandra stood still, not basking in the ovation, but grounding herself in the responsibility it represented. She had not chosen this role, but she had embraced it. Later that night, alone in her hotel room, Cassandra gazed out at the city skyline. She thought of her parents, their lessons etched into her bones. She thought of the passengers on Flight 227 who had raised their phones, their voices, their courage. She thought of the young woman on tonight's flight who had whispered her thanks. And she whispered back into the quiet, as if speaking to them all. Dignity isn't granted, it's defended. The words had carried her through humiliation, through hearings, through reforms. Now they carried her into legacy. She knew the work was far from done. There would be new challenges, new injustices, new battles to fight, but she also knew the story of Flight 227 would remain as both a scar and a beacon, a reminder of what could happen when courage met truth. Cassandra turned from the window, switched off the lamp, and let the night settle. Tomorrow, she would rise again to defend dignity, not just for herself, but for everyone still waiting to be seen. As the cabin lights dim on this story, one truth remains: dignity should never be conditional. What began with a slap on Flight 227 became a spark that lit reforms across the skies. Cassandra Wright's calm defiance reminded us that respect is not a privilege for the few, but a right for all. Rosa's courage, Ruiz's integrity, and the voices of ordinary passengers showed the power of standing up when silence would have been easier. Yet this story also forces us to confront the darkness, how entitlement, prejudice, and cowardice can still thrive in places meant for safety and service. It reminds us that injustice doesn't always come shouting. Sometimes it comes disguised as procedure, as policy, as someone telling you to move. We are left with both outrage and hope. Outrage at what Cassandra endured, but hope in the change her resilience inspired. And now, the question is passed to us when dignity is tested. Will we defend it if this story moved you? Let it live beyond this screen. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Join us as we continue to tell the stories that demand justice, honor courage, and remind us all of our shared humanity.